Father in heaven, as we open your word once more this evening, I pray that you'd bless us with wisdom and understanding. As we go through the 11th chapter of Daniel, Father, I pray that you'd help us to see the importance of history in prophecy. Lord, help us to study the things of the past that we can be ready for the things that are to come into the future. And help us to give a reason of the hope that is within us. Bless us now, I pray, in Jesus' name. Amen. Yesterday we left off at verse 22, which talked about how Jesus was crucified by the Roman Empire. And so it helped us to understand clearly where we were in this prophecy. I want to remind you that there is a great need of going back to search the scriptures, and on top of that, search out history to match up with what we've been studying in Daniel chapter 11. But verse 22 gives us a very good indicator and time framing of where we are. And of course, the previous verses where it talks about how he'll be a raiser of taxes, clearly pointing out the Roman Empire. But I just want to reiterate that there is much greater study, and there is not going to be much detail I'm going to be giving you in regard to the first 30 verses of Daniel chapter 11. Why? Because it's all history. History that if I were to give you, you probably would not understand in regard to the names. So I'm asking you to go back and search out the history. First source that I recommend is Daniel and the Revelation by Uriah Smith. So please, do yourself a favor and go back and study that book in regard to the 11th chapter of Daniel. Especially the first 30 verses anyways. I'm not really recommending the verses after that to look at. But let's go on. Verse 23 of Daniel 11. Let's go there. Daniel chapter 11 and verse 23. By God's grace, we're going to get through the rest of this chapter this evening. If not, we're going to finish it off in the next class. We have 3 classes left, including this one, and then we'll be done. But Daniel chapter 11, verse 23. And after the league made with him, he shall work deceitfully, for he shall come up and shall become strong with a small people. This is talking about the league that the Roman Empire made with the Jewish nation. And truly, during this time, the Romans were a small group of people. They weren't a large empire as yet. But then we see in verse 24, he shall enter peaceably even upon the fattest places of the province, and he shall do that which his fathers have not done, nor his fathers' fathers. He shall scatter among them the prey, and spoil and riches. Yea, he shall forecast his devices against the strongholds, even for a time. This is talking about how the Romans, at that time, they were small, but they grew to be a large empire. It came into a great power soon after. And it goes even to the point where it says they shall do that which their fathers had not done before. And as we know, as we looked at in history now for us, the Roman Empire was one of the greatest empires that existed back then, as it reigned from 168 BC all the way to 476 AD. So it spanned a great amount of time. So it was a great empire. But moving on, verse 25, and he shall stir up his power and his courage against the king of the south with a great army, and the king of the south shall be stirred up to battle with a very great and mighty army. But he shall not stand. Who shall not stand? The king of the south. For they shall forecast devices against him. This is talking about how Rome went down to fight against Egypt, and talks about how Cleopatra gets involved in this as well. There's much history to look at here, but once again, I'm asking you to go back to search it out. But it talks about how there was a great war on the sea, one that probably has not been heard of or seen in such magnificence since then. But Rome came out on top, and we go on, verse 26, yea, they that feed of the portion of his meat shall destroy him, and his army shall overflow, and many shall fall down slain. And this talks about how, verse 25 and 26 talks about a king named Antony, who married himself to Cleopatra, but perished and killed himself in this war at the end. And so we see the king of the south perishing in this instance. And then moving on, verse 27, and both these kings' hearts shall be to do mischief, and they shall speak lies at one table, but it shall not prosper, for yet the end shall be at the time appointed. Speaking of this man, this King Antony, who tried to make an alliance with the king of Rome. His name, Augustus. And they made an alliance through Augustus' sister, whom Antony married, but later left to go down to Cleopatra. But this alliance was formed trying to make peace with both nations, but it was not possible. It did not exist. It was political move. And so it said that it shall not prosper. And then in verse 28, then shall he return. Who? Augustus. He shall return to his own land with great riches, and his heart shall be against the holy covenant. And he shall do exploits and return to his own land. This prophesies or talks about the destruction of Jerusalem. And how when Augustus will come back, he will bring riches back from Egypt with him after conquering the king of the south. But then he sets his eyes upon the Holy Covenant. The Romans were the ones that destroyed Jerusalem. AD when? AD 70. Verse 29, at the time appointed he shall return and come toward the south, but it shall not be as the former or as the latter. This verse here describes the fall of pagan Rome during that time. When it says that it shall be not as the former or as the latter, really what it's referring to is the conquest that it made in Egypt and also in Judea, where they had victory over that. But it would not be the same in the sense that this is talking about the barbaric tribes that would come and rip the kingdom apart. And of course, it's during this time that the seat of the empire is removed and moved over to Constantinople. So things are changing here, and we're seeing in verse 29 the fall of pagan Roman Empire. And so much description is given to the pagan Roman Empire, which had not been given in the past. But now we still have some 15 verses left. What empire are we expecting, or kingdom, to come next? What comes after pagan Rome? Papal Rome. So keep this in mind. First 30 verses of Daniel 11, there has not been much contention over. But you've got to keep this in mind that as we now enter into the latter part of the verses, half of it, not so half, but maybe about a third of it is prophetic still to us. The other portion is historical, but this is where historians such as Uriah Smith go differently. He would talk about Turkey. And I mentioned this earlier, but it cannot be. You know, James White wrote against this and saying that if we look at Daniel 2, 7, 8, we don't see any mention of Turkey coming out after pagan Roman Empire. What we always see is papal Rome, papal Rome, papal Rome. And so that's why it's important to establish the principle of repeat and enlarge. So when we come to Daniel 11, the next kingdom that we're seeing has to be papal Rome. And this is what we start reading in verse 30. For the ships of Chittim shall come against him, therefore he shall be grieved and return, and have indignation against the holy covenant. So shall he do. He shall even return and have intelligence with them that forsake the holy covenant. So a transition is about to take place from verses 30 to 31. The power is about to shift from pagan Rome to papal Rome. And when we look at the ships of Chittim, what it's talking about is the barbaric tribes that come down that rip pagan Rome apart from the inside. And really, when it says the ships, it gives us the understanding of what? Warfare at the sea. Now, there was one tribe that waged war against the Roman Empire on the sea. Although the Romans were quite good on the sea, this one barbaric tribe that stood out above all others that succeeded on the sea were the Vandals. The Vandals. These Vandals, you'll remember that they also occupied northern Africa as well. So they were masters at the sea. And that's why it talks about the ships of Chittim, one of the barbaric tribes. And so we're beginning to see the kingdom of Rome, pagan Roman Empire that is, being ripped apart at the seams. And one of the instrumentalities was the tribe that came from the sea, the Vandals. Verse 31, and arms shall stand on his part, and they shall pollute the sanctuary of strength, and shall take away the daily, and they shall place the abomination that maketh desolate. Now we're seeing familiar language that we looked at in Daniel 8. We already know what the daily is. What is that? It's paganism. So we don't need to re-establish that. We understand already what the daily is. It says that the daily shall be taken away, and they shall place the abomination that maketh desolate, which is who? Papacy. Abomination of desolation. So we saw that. But what we're seeing in the beginning there, it says, arms shall stand on his part. What is it referring to? Military strength shall stand on his part. Now the military power will cooperate or collaborate with this power in order to set it up. This is a parallel of Daniel chapter 8 and verse 12. Let's go there. This is exactly what we're seeing in Daniel 8 verse 12. It's just an expansion, an addition, and more detail is given now. Daniel 8 and verse 12. Let's go over there. The Bible says, and an host was given him against the daily, by reason of transgression, and it cast down the truth to the ground, and it practiced and prospered. So we're seeing that an host is given him. And we go back to verse 31 in Daniel 11. It says, arms shall stand on his part. An army is given. And so something is being taken away, and something else is being set up in its place. There is a transition taking place. Just as we saw that in Daniel 8, verse 12, it's transition from pagan Rome to papal Rome. We're seeing this transition take place again. That's why it was so important to establish that understanding in Daniel chapter 8. So when we get to it, we're finally seeing the characteristics of the papacy come out and how the papacy absorbed what? Paganism. They took away the pagan sanctuaries and simply took over. In the same place where the pagan sanctuaries used to be, they set up their church. Catholic Church. Papacy. But who is the arms here? What is this referring to? Who gives military strength to the papacy to establish the abomination that maketh desolate? In 508 AD, now you want to take note of these dates. 508 AD, Clovis was the emperor of the Franks, or what we know today as France. He was at that time the most powerful political military leader in the West. Clovis's wife was a Roman Catholic. A devout Roman Catholic to that extent. And his personal advisor was also a Roman Catholic bishop. Although he was a pagan through and through, he married a Roman Catholic, and his personal advisor was also a Catholic as well. And the Catholic Church knew that Clovis would greatly enhance their stature if they could convince Clovis to come along. And Clovis, just like Constantine, also had a unique conversion experience. And we're going to look at this, okay? Clovis was so-called converted in 496 AD. What happened? He went out to war against the Alemanni at this time. And in this battle, he was fighting against... The Alemanni was one of the Germanic tribes that ripped apart the Roman Empire. And he went out to fight against them. And during this battle, it seemed like he was on the verge of losing. And it was exactly a parallel experience with Constantine, you see. And while he was on the verge of losing, he vows to the God of his wife, saying that if he helps him win this battle, he would follow him. And of course, he ends up winning the battle, and it's said that he went and baptizes his troops and himself, and he becomes a quote-unquote Roman Catholic. And you got to understand that he was the first king of the West in the Roman Empire there, because there was still a few factions in Rome that hadn't fully solidified into one kingdom yet. But he was the first king to be a Christian king. The rest were pagan kings. So after this, when he became a Christian, or when he was quote-unquote converted, he now turned all his wars into holy wars. You need to understand this, because he was a smart man. He was looking at a political advantage as well. And so he turned all his wars into holy wars. And what happened was that since he was the only Christian king, all the Christians or the Catholics would then come to his support. Because the rest of the kings surrounding him were all pagan kings. But now you have this Catholic king. And so all the support now is given to him. and he has greater advantage. And that's why he turned all his wars into holy wars. And historians write that wherever Clovis conquered, the Roman Catholic Church also conquered. This is what happened. So when he declared the wars, all the Catholics joined to support him. And in 507 AD, note this date down, 507 AD, he went out to fight against the Visigoths and conquered them. This war in 507 AD made him sole ruler in the West. Finally, he became, and I'm talking about the Western Roman Empire, he finally became the sole ruler in the Western Roman Empire. And since his conversion in 496 AD, now all the pagan kings were gone. Paganism ceased to exist as a national religion. Now the religion, because there's only one king now, and that king was what? He was Catholic. The national religion for the nation became Catholicism. And this is what we're seeing, that transition, and this is where we're lining up Bible with history. We're seeing the transition of paganism into Catholicism. And so now, because the king is a Catholic or a Christian, quote unquote, paganism was ushered out, and the sole ruler of the West was no longer a pagan but a Catholic. That's how paganism, or the daily, was taken away or exalted, so to speak. You see that? Transformation of pagan king. And we can, from the outside, see that this was just a mere political move. But so in 508 AD is the beginning of the abomination that maketh desolate. Why paganism has been ushered out, and in 508 AD is the beginning of the papacy. This is just the beginning. It is not completed until 30 years later, when Justinian of the East makes a decree that gives the Roman Catholic Church papal supremacy. So 508 AD is the beginning of the abomination that maketh desolate. Okay? This understanding will become much more clearer as we get into Daniel 12. But just understand, you need to know all this history, especially from around late 400s to early 500s. Because you see the transition. When did pagan Roman Empire fall again? 476 AD. From there until 538, there's a transition taking place. And we see this in Daniel 8 and also Daniel 11. Arms shall stand in his part, take away the daily, and set up the abomination that maketh desolate. And we see this in 2 Thessalonians 2. Let's go over there. 2 Thessalonians chapter 2. The people that were existing that time, they understood this. In 2 Thessalonians chapter 2, in verses 7 and 8, it is clear. In verse 7 it says, "For the mystery of iniquity doth already work. Only he who now letteth will let, until he be taken out of the way." Who had to be taken out of the way for the mystery of iniquity to work? Or verse 8, "And then shall that wicked be revealed." Who is that referring to? Yes, Satan to a great degree, but it was referring to the papacy. Now, in order for the papacy to come up or rise up, pagan Roman Empire had to be taken away, or paganism. So even the people of the olden times understood this. And they say the mystery of iniquity could not come up, or that wicked one be revealed, until he be taken out of the way. Who is that? It was referring to the pagan Roman Empire. Because they understood soon after that the papacy would rise. So we see this principle even drawn out here, how there's a transition as well. But let's go back to Daniel chapter 11 and verse 32 now. We've seen papacy arise, and now we see in verse 32, very clear. "And such as do wickedly against the covenant shall he corrupt by flatteries. But the people that do know their God shall be strong and do exploits." Now, this is talking about the period now after 538 AD, when the papacy has already come to papal supremacy. Verses 30 and 31 was its transition verses, and now verse 32, talking about the papacy in its power. It says that they, "And such as do wickedly against the covenant, shall he corrupt by flatteries." Who is this referring to? It's referring to the Waldensians, the Albigenses, Huguenots, Anabaptists, the Reformers, during the Dark Ages. And how did the Catholic Church win against these people? Flattered them. Flattered them. Because in the latter verse it says, but the people that do know their God shall be strong and do exploits. These groups, I'm going to repeat them again, the Waldensians, famous group of the old, the Albigenses, the Huguenots, and the Anabaptists. These were four main groups that went against the Catholic Church, that did exploits, quote unquote, against them. You know, I mean, I'm sure you've heard of the Waldensians. I mean, these people memorize large portions of Scripture. And they'll go out selling different precious jewels, but then at the end they would sell also, or share with them, other people, the Word of God. And they memorized large portions of Scripture that they could quote to other people. You know, this was the sort of faith that the Waldensians had. And it was pure. But what happened, it says that they should corrupt them by their flatteries. What happened? The Waldensians actually they weren't killed off. They were corrupted, in a sense, in their doctrine. The Waldensians had a very pure doctrine and pure understanding of the Bible, which even our Reformers didn't, because the Reformers are the ones that came out of other churches. You know, Luther he gave us a justification by faith, but he still had misunderstandings of different portions of Scripture that we believe today. But the Waldensians were a pure sort of race that came out in terms of the faith. Moving on, verse 33. It's going to get clearer as we move on. Watch this. And they that understand among the people shall instruct many, yet they shall fall by the sword and by flame, by captivity, and by spoil many days. So these that understand shall instruct many. The Waldensians, they had a very strong education system. It was called the College of the Barbs. And this is where they would memorize a chapter a week of the Bible. Their education on the Bible was second to none. There was none that could match them. And, you know, they went out and shared these things. But yet it says, they shall fall by the sword, by flame, by captivity, and by spoil, referring to the Dark Ages, where many thousands and millions were killed for the faith. You know, Waldensians, they would not marry before they went out, because they would say at least half or 50% would not return. So only when they returned from their exploits would they then get married, because it was not guaranteed that they would return at the end of their journey. And this is the nature of the work that they had. This was the Waldensians. And of course, there were many others, Huguenots or Anabaptists, that existed during that time, but martyrs were around during this time. We see it in Hebrews. Let's go over there. Hebrews chapter 11, verses 36 through 38. Hebrews 11, verses 36 through 38. This is the famous chapter of the Hall of Faith. And yes, the Waldensians, the Dark Ages, those people that lived through the Dark Ages were prophesied of in here. Hebrews 11, verses 36 through 38. And others had trial of cruel mockings and scourgings, yea, moreover, of bonds and imprisonment. They were stoned, they were sawn asunder, were tempted, were slain with a sword. They wandered about in sheepskins and goatskins, being destitute, afflicted, tormented, of whom the world was not worthy. They wandered in deserts and in mountains and in dens and caves of the earth. Speaking of the Dark Ages and how many would give up their lives for their faith. And it says at the end there, many days. What is that referring to? The 1260-year period. Now let's move on. Chapter 11, verse 34. Now when they shall fall, they shall be holpen with a little help, but many shall cleave to them with flatteries. Now the start of that verse there, it says, when they shall fall, they shall be holpen with a little help. The massacre of 1655, where the Waldensians were almost wiped off the face of the earth. But during that time, soon after, there occurred an unbelievable event, which we call the Reformation. God brought help through people like Luther, Zwingli, Knox, Calvin, the reformers of old who went and started speaking up against the Catholic Church, that God raised up from within. I mean, you understand that Luther was a monk. He was a Catholic priest. That's who he was, but he started speaking up against the Catholic Church as well. So they were helped But it says, but many shall cleave to them with flatteries. And exactly what I was pointing out before, the Waldensians were never wiped off the face of the earth. They were corrupted by their doctrine, and since then they ceased existing as a peculiar sort of race. And so this is what happened. They just lost their faith. And you can read all these details in the Great Controversy. The first few chapters, or actually the first portion of the Great Controversy, it deals a lot with the history of the Dark Ages. And so you got to learn to like history when you come to study prophecy. You have to. It is very, very important. And I believe we need to go back to that time of memorizing scripture like the Waldensians. I mean, we don't even do it. It doesn't even become important to us. Why? Because we're not living in the midst of persecution now. And God says what we don't learn in the time of peace, we're going to be forced to learn in the time of trouble. And so I would recommend that we all go back and start memorizing portions of scripture. For, if it's not for your own spiritual welfare, at least for the sake of others in the future, that you could start helping them through dark times. Moving on, verse 35, and some of them of understanding shall fall, to try them and to purge and to make them white, even to the time of the end, because it is yet for an appointed time. Them of understanding, who's that referring to? Those in verse 33 of the Anabaptists, Waldensians, all these people. But it says that they will be made white even to the time of the end. Now, what is the time of the end referring to? You see, we already have an establishment here of the papacy, okay? So we know that the time of the end must be sometime after 538, because from verses 34 all the way up to 32 all the way up to 35, it's describing the Dark Ages and how the papacy persecuted God's people. So when is the time of the end? We at least know that it must exist after the persecution. So they'll be persecuted even to the time of the end. Now, to help us to establish this date, let's go over to Daniel chapter 12 and verse 4. Let's go there. Daniel 12 and verse 4. Note the wordings that we see here in Daniel 12 and verse 4. It says, but thou, O Daniel, shut up the words and seal the book, even to the time of the end. Many shall run to and fro, and knowledge shall be increased. So Daniel's book will be shut up or sealed until when? Even to the time of the end. Now jump down with me to verse 9. And it says this, and he said, go thy way, Daniel, for the words are closed up and sealed till the time of the end. Did you notice that? When it mentioned the word time of the end, the word till and even are synonymous with each other. So when in verse 4 it says, shut up the book and seal it even to the time of the end, it also means till the time of the end. So therefore God's people will be killed till the time of the end, and then persecution will be stopped. If you look back at verse 35, let's go back there in chapter 11. We're trying to determine when the time of the end is. It says, and some of them of understanding shall fall, to try them and to purge and to make them white, even or till to the time of the end, because it is yet for appointed time. So when is the time of the end? It is referring to 1798. The end of the 1260-year period is when persecution stopped, when the deadly wound was inflicted in Revelation 13, when papal supremacy was taken away. Where do we see this? Daniel 7:25. A time, times, and dividing a time. That's why it says here, even for a time appointed. What is that time appointed? 1798. The end of the time, times, and dividing a time. The end of the 1260-year period that we see in Revelation chapter 12. So when is the time of the end? 1798. Now, the time of the end per se is not an exact date. It is a time period, a time of the end. You see that? Because we are still living at the time of the end. But we're at the end of the time of the end. There's a difference between saying the time of the end and the end of time. Do you understand that? Let me give you a quick illustration here. Many people use this, but just bear with me. For a turkey, The time of the end begins when you start feeding it so that it can get fat, have a lot of meat, to eat it at Thanksgiving. So you, in 5 months in advance, you start feeding the turkey. It is the beginning of the time of the end. You see that? When is the end of time for the turkey? It is when you take it out, start plucking its feathers off and kill it. That is the end of time for the turkey. But the time of the end began for that turkey when you had in mind what you wanted it to do, feed you at Thanksgiving. So you treated it a certain way so it would come out best in terms of meat on your plate at the end of the day. You understand that? That is the difference between the time of the end and the end of time. We're living at the end of the time of the end. That means we're living at the end of time now. If you're not convicted of that, you need to go back and study Matthew 24. But all the signs are there to tell us that we are at the end of time. So, the time period of 538 to 1798 in Daniel 11 is given. It's clear there, time of the end. This does not mean that the next verses are in time chronological order. The next verse speaks about what the power does during the time. This time, he picks up where he left off in verse 32. Because you see, many people in verse 36 point, it says, the king shall do according to his will. Oh, a new power shall stand up. But this is incorrect. Actually, verse 36 is a continuation of verse 32. What happened is that verse 31 introduced the papacy, and then it describes the Dark Ages, but then it goes back to talk about the papacy. And as you read the characteristics in verse 36, it points it out very clearly. But I just want you to be clear about this, because you see, this is where people begin to say, this is where Turkey rises up. A new power, a new king. But let me show you, okay? Watch this. The king shall do according to what? His will. Underscore this phrase, shall do according to his will. And I want to read some phrases, some quotes to you from Sister White, to make it clear that this power, this king that stands up, that does according to his will, is still speaking about papacy and not a new power that stands up. Okay? Great Controversy, page 50. Great Controversy, page 50. This compromise between paganism and Christianity resulted in the development of the man of sin foretold in prophecy as opposing and exalting himself above God. Who is this referring to? Papacy. That gigantic system of false religion is a masterpiece of Satan's power, a monument of his efforts to seat himself upon the throne to rule the earth according to his will. Quoting right out of Daniel 11 verse 36, and the king shall do according to his will. Speaking of the papacy. But I'm going to give you one more reference that you need to write this down, okay? Manuscript Releases, volume 13. As a symbol, you just put 13MR for Manuscript Releases, page 924. It is clear that it's going to be talking about the papacy. Manuscript Releases, volume 13, page 924. It begins like this. We have no time to lose. Troublous times are before us. The world is stirred with the spirit of war. Soon the scenes of trouble spoken of in the prophecies will take place. The prophecy in the 11th of Daniel has nearly reached its complete fulfillment. Much of the history that has taken place in fulfillment of this prophecy will be repeated. In the 13th verse, a power is spoken of that shall be grieved. In the 30th verse, a power is spoken of that shall be grieved and return and have indignation against the holy covenant. So shall he do. He shall even return and have intelligence with them that forsake the holy covenant. Now in verse 30, what power was speaking of there? Papacy. Transition from paganism to papacy. And then she writes down, it doesn't write out here, but she quotes verses 31 through 36. She puts them all together and says, scenes similar to those described in these words will take place. So she joins up verse 31 all the way to verse what? 36. Now we were looking at verse 36 where it says, and the king shall do according to his will. So this power spoken of in verse 31 is the same power spoken of in verse 36. None other than the papacy. Now, let me give you the characteristics that is described here in verse 36. Okay, let's read through this. And the king shall do according to his will, and he shall exalt himself and magnify himself above every god, and shall speak marvelous things against the God of gods, and shall prosper till the indignation be accomplished, for that is determined shall be done. First characteristic, it says that he shall magnify himself above every god. Immediately we should go back to 2 Thessalonians chapter 2. Let's go there and read verses 3 and 4. In the reference to this power magnifying himself above every god. 2 Thessalonians chapter 2 verses 3 and 4. 2 Thessalonians chapter 2 verses 3 and 4, the Bible says, "Let no man deceive you by any means, for that day shall not come, except there come a falling away first, and that man of sin be revealed, the son of perdition." Then it describes this man of sin, son of perdition, whom we know to be the papacy clearly, who opposeth and exalteth himself above all that is called God, or that is worshipped, so that he as God sitteth in the temple of God, showing himself that he is God. The man of sin does that. And of course, we're seeing religious entity come out in verse 36 of Daniel 11. So that's the first characteristic to show us that this is a religious and political entity, because there's a king standing up saying he is above all gods, political and religious. Second thing, it says that he shall speak marvelous words against the God of gods. And of course, we see this in Revelation 13 verse 5, where it says that there was given him a mouth speaking great things, and also Daniel 7:25, where it says that he shall speak great words against the Most High. So we're seeing clearly that verse 36 of Daniel 11 pardon me, is speaking of the papacy. Now there's one more. It says that till the indignation be accomplished. Now if we see and look at Revelation 14 verses 9 through 11, the third angel's message, we see that this indignation that is being referred to is the wrath of God being poured out. In verse 10 it says, the same shall drink of the wine of the wrath of God, which is poured out without mixture into the cup of his indignation. So till the indignation be accomplished is speaking up till what? The 7 last plagues, the wrath of God. And that power that exists from then is the papacy. We see this. Why? Because it's the last power that existed in the feet until the second coming. that was Daniel 2. Now let's move on, verse 37. Neither shall he regard the God of his fathers, nor the desire of woman, nor regard any God, for he shall magnify himself above all. And truly the papacy does not magnify, or regard, the God of his fathers. They did not regard the God of the apostles. And nor, it says, the desire of woman. What is that talking about? Celibacy. Priest cannot marry. Let's go over to 1 Timothy, and we'll see this clearly. 1 Timothy chapter 4, verses 1 through 3. 1 Timothy chapter 4, verses 1 through 3. The Bible says, "Now the Spirit speaketh expressly, that in the latter times some shall depart from the faith, giving heed to seducing spirits and doctrines of devils, speaking lies in hypocrisy, having their conscience seared with a hot iron, forbidding to marry, and commanding to abstain from meats which God hath created to be received with thanksgiving of them which believe and know the truth." So even it speaks about this power in 1 Timothy, how it says, forbidding to marry. Lines up with Daniel 11 and the power that is described there in verse 37, which we already established to be the papacy. 1 Timothy chapter 4, verses 1 through 3. But then it also says at the end of verse 37, let's go back to Daniel 11, it says, "Nor regard any God, for he shall magnify himself above all." And that is exactly what the Pope does. God on earth. And of course in Daniel 7:20, when it says that his look was more stout than his fellows, more arrogant, more proud. So that is exactly what the papacy is pointed out as proud above all other gods. But then in verse 38 it says, "But in his estate shall he honor the God of forces, and a God whom his fathers knew not shall he honor with gold and silver and with precious stones and pleasant things." And certainly the papacy is nothing but the God of force. They honor force. Why? They persecuted from 538 to 1798, 1290 days. They are honoring force there. And it says also, "A God whom his fathers knew not shall he honor with" what? "Gold and silver and with precious stones and pleasant things." Now, if you jump over with me to Revelation 17 and verse 4, let's go there. Revelation 17 and verse 4, we'll also see a parallel text mentioned here, pointing out the papacy as well. Revelation chapter 17 and verse 4, the Bible says, "And the woman was arrayed in purple and scarlet color, and decked with gold and precious stones and pearls, having a golden cup in her hand full of abominations and filthiness of her fornication." Speaking of the papacy, the Catholic Church is a very rich church. Even today, you go into their churches, they are a very wealthy church. There are ornaments, there's gold there. There are things there that would make any other Protestant church look just dim and dull in comparison. The Catholic Church is a wealthy church. But then it goes on to say, in verse 39, "Thus shall he do in the most strongholds with a strange God, whom he shall acknowledge and increase with glory. And he shall cause them to rule over many, and shall divide the land for gain." What sort of strange God has the Catholic Church brought out? Her name is Mary. Mary receives greater adoration than Jesus himself. I mean, if you go into the Catholic churches, they're not shy to portray this, so this is nothing secret that I'm telling you. You go there and you'll see the words written over Mary. What? Immaculate Conception. She is honored also as a God. For how can a virgin give birth to a baby? Immaculate Conception. And so Mary has become more of a God than Jesus Christ himself should have been. You know? And of course you have all sorts of saints that are brought into sainthood. And of course they have Peter being one of the saints too that formed the basis of the Catholic Church. But it says they're honoring gods that their fathers didn't know. And they didn't know Mary to be a God back then. And she is not a God. Jesus Christ is the God. But it says that they shall also divide the land for gain. And of course the Catholic Church would get a king and ask him to conquer them and would give it to them for a certain amount. And so they sold the land for gain. And of course we have indulgences there too, getting gain through giving money to get their dead ones out of hell faster. So you see the Catholic Church being pointed out clearly here as a very rich king, because that is what the Catholic or papal supremacy was all about. Because they would only exist as a nation when they had the backing of what? Political entity behind it. And so clearly we're seeing from verses 31 or 30 all the way up to verses 39, the Catholic Church is clear. Clearly seen there. Is established. It's not Turkey. It is the papacy. But now we come into verse 40. Personally, I believe that verse 40 is, we're now stepping into prophecy here, somewhat. And verse 40 is partially fulfilled. But we're now seeing the king of the south come out again. It hadn't been mentioned for about quite a number of verses. But in verse 40 it says, "And at the time of the end shall the king of the south push at him. And the king of the north shall come against him like a whirlwind, with chariots and with horsemen and with many ships. And he shall enter into the countries and shall overflow and pass over." This is at the time of the end. When is that referring to? Time of the end, what date is that? 1798. So this verse is referring to 1798. We're going back in time, yes, but what's happening? It says the king of the south shall push at him. And what is it referring to? Who is the king of the south? Well, geographically, what is this talking about? King of the south. Egypt. What do we understand about Egypt though? Atheism. You remember in Exodus, when Pharaoh said and stood up against Moses and said, "Who is God? Who is God?" The claims of an atheistic power. And so we're seeing around 1798 that an atheistic nation rises up against him. Who is that? Who is that atheistic nation that rises up against the papacy around 1798? Is none other than France again. It's interesting to see that how the papacy was established as a worldwide power by the backing of the French during that time in 538. And now it's the same power that comes back and takes the Pope or papacy off its throne. This is the very power that prepared the way for setting up of Rome. It's the same power that took it down as well. Inflicting of the deadly wound. We're seeing the French Revolution rise up and communism with it as well. An atheistic power. Now these are all in the history books, so it's not something that you're going to find hidden as well. You just need to go back and search out the French Revolution and the reasons why it rose up against the papacy. But the French were the ones that took the Pope off the throne and put him into prison, thus inflicting the deadly wound. Now it says, "Shall the king of the south push at him," referring to the papal power which is described in the previous texts. King of the north. Now it mentions there, "And the king of the north shall come against him like a whirlwind." What are we seeing here? We're seeing now a reviving of this power that will go against communism. Because communism was established by the French Revolution. You understand that, right? Historically, where did communism come up from? The French Revolution. And it says that the king of the north shall push against him. So we see the king of the south come against the papacy, inflicts a deadly wound, 1798. But then it says, "And the king of the north shall come against him like a whirlwind, with chariots and with horsemen and with many ships. He shall enter into the countries and shall overflow and pass over." Have we seen communism fall in relation to the papacy? We sure have. Who did the papacy link arms with to make some communist countries fall? Have you heard of the Wall of Berlin? It's a communist country. You know what happened there? The Catholic Church allied themselves with a country to make it fall. Who was that country? United States of America. And that's exactly what it has begun to do. So we see the fall of communism, downfall of Soviet Union in this verse as well. Going back and forth. King of the South inflicts a deadly wound, but King of the North now comes back against him and is going against communism, causing the fall of communism with the help of the United States of America. So this is what we're seeing in verse 40. But then we get into verse 41. Now notice in verse 40 end there it says, "And shall overflow and pass over." This has not been fully fulfilled yet. Now this is why I'm saying it's partially fulfilled, because communistic countries still exist today. They still exist, they're still out there. China is one of them, and of course Cuba and Korea. So we have still communism existing or living on from the South, King of the South. So that's why I say verse 40 is partially fulfilled. Now let's look at verse 41. "He shall enter also into the glorious land, and many countries shall be overthrown, but these shall escape out of his hand, even Edom and Moab, and the chief of the children of Ammon." Now it says he. Who is a he referring to then? "He shall also enter into the glorious land." He is referring to the papacy. And who is the glorious land referring to? Now this cannot be United States of America. Why? Because United States of America was already allied in bringing the downfall of what? Communism. So you can't suddenly change picture. Now it's going to enter also into the glorious land. So we already know that the glorious land cannot be United States of America. The glorious land has always been referring to God's people. If you look in your margin there in that verse, verse 41, what does it say in relation to the glorious land? What does it say? Goodly land or land of delight. Do you see that? Do you folks have a middle column there? Do you see that? It says goodly land or land of delight. And this goodly land or the land of delight has always been referring to Canaan. And what was Canaan in regard to? The children of Israel. And what were the Israelites considered? God's people. But let me show you some text, okay? In solidifying who this glorious land is, Deuteronomy chapter 4 and verse 22. Let's go there first. Deuteronomy chapter 4 and verse 22. Deuteronomy chapter 4 and verse 22. And it says here, "But I must die in this land, I must not go over Jordan, but ye shall go over and possess that good land." Moses was speaking here and says, I'm going to die before I get into the land of Canaan. And that land that he referred to was called a what? Goodly land. Similar to what we see in glorious land in Daniel 11, referring to that glorious land, which was interpreted as a goodly or delightsome land. Deuteronomy 4:22 was the first text. Now let's go to Malachi chapter 3, verses 10 through 12. Malachi chapter 3, verses 10 through 12. Malachi 3, 10 through 12, it says, "Bring ye all the tithes into the storehouse, that there may be meat in mine house, and prove me now herewith, saith the Lord of hosts, if I will not open you the windows of heaven, and pour you out a blessing, that there shall not be room enough to receive it. And I will rebuke the devourer for your sakes, and he shall not destroy the fruits of your ground, neither shall your vine cast her fruit from the time in the field, saith the Lord of hosts. And all nations shall call you blessed, for ye shall be a delightsome land, saith the Lord of hosts." What is this delightsome land? Who is God speaking here to? About tithes and offerings? He's referring to his people. He's referring to the land of Canaan. He's referring to the Israelite nation. Let's look at another one. Jeremiah chapter 3, verses 18 through 19. Jeremiah chapter 3, verses 18 through 19. This is referring to the time when the Israelites were allowed to go back and rebuild. You know, Jeremiah was a contemporary of Daniel. And he was speaking to the time of when they were allowed to go back and rebuild. And Jeremiah was calling them out. Go back to Israelite. Go back to Israel. Come out of Babylon and go back and rebuild. That was his message. And he had to plead with them because many were so like the Israelites of old. When they were in Egypt, they were so happy and content with their leeks and their onions. And that's why Jeremiah was pleading with them. Come out and go back to Israel to rebuild the temple. Now it says here in Jeremiah 3 verses 18 and 19, it says, in those days, literally he was speaking of those days if they had fulfilled it. But it says, in those days the house of Judah shall walk with the house of Israel, and they shall come together out of the land of the north, to the land that I have given for an inheritance unto your fathers. What is that north country? It is Babylon. In the same way, there's a call to come out of Babylon in Revelation as well, that land of the north, to an inheritance unto your fathers, which was Canaan. And of course, we are to inherit the heavenly, spiritual Canaan in the future. Verse 19, but I said, how shall I put thee among the children, and give thee a pleasant land, a goodly heritage of the host of nations? And I said, thou shalt call me my father, and shalt not return away from me. So in those days when Jeremiah was pleading for the children to come out and possess the inheritance, to come out of Babylon, that land of the north, to inherit Canaan again, they were to, after that, grow into a nation and encompass the whole world. That was the desire of God then. But it didn't happen. And so what we're seeing is a transferring of the covenants. It didn't happen with them, so it's happening with us today. So what we're seeing here in Daniel 11 has moved from now literal, but it's become spiritual. It's governed by the context, because we're seeing here that from verse 30 in Daniel 11 already, It's speaking about the papacy already. So it cannot go back into the past to speak about a literal Canaan and Israelite nation. So what we're seeing now is it's become spiritual. What is this pleasant land or glorious land spoken of in Daniel 11? It is God's people. Let's look at one more text. Psalms 106. Psalms 106, and this will also be very clear too. Psalms 106, verses 23 to 24. Psalms 106, verses 23 to 24. It says, "Therefore he said that he would destroy them, had not Moses his chosen stood before him in the breach." So what is this describing? Remember when they made that golden calf, and God said, "I'll destroy them, but Moses, I'll make of you a great nation." And Moses stood in the breach. He interceded for them. He says, "God, don't you remember? You took them out of Egypt. Why do you want to destroy them now?" He says, "But if you won't, blot my name out of the book of life." Remember that? It says, "To turn away his wrath, lest he should destroy them. Yea, they despise the pleasant land. They believed not his word." And what happened? When they got to the borders of Canaan, the 12 spies were sent out, and 10 said, "We can't take it." And 2 said, "We could." God said, "Well, they despise the pleasant land. What I'm going to do, I'm going to make them wander in the wilderness for 40 years till all the ones that came out of Egypt are destroyed, and a new generation will go in and possess the pleasant land," or what we call Canaan. So what is pleasant land or goodly land or delightsome land or glorious land referring to? It was Canaan or Israelite nation. It was God's people. And of course we understand that Israelite nation does not exist today as God's people. They exist as what? A church. So therefore, since we take Egypt and the king of the north spiritually, we see the king of the south coming up, communism arising, France arising. Then we also see what? We must also, in a sense, take the glorious land as spiritual. And so who is this glorious land? Spiritual Israel. God's people, or could I say, the SDA church. So this glorious land is referring to the SDA church. And it says that he shall enter also into the glorious land. And I can guarantee you there are Jesuits in the SDA church today. They existed during Ellen White's time, and praise the Lord, we had a prophet to write against it. But they exist today in our church. Jesuits, the Society of Jesus, they are working hard to overthrow God's people today. But it also says that many countries shall also be overthrown. And, in that sense, it's talking about, to a great degree, not many SDAs will be going to heaven. Just because you're in God's church, just because you're part of God's people, it doesn't mean that you're going to heaven. Many shall be overthrown. Many. And then, but it says that even what? Edom and Moab and the chief children of Ammon, these shall even escape out of his hand. Now, when you go back and study out Edom, Moab, and Ammon, there is much to look there, and I can't say that I have all authority on this, but I just want to share with you what I have found. Come with me to Isaiah chapter 11. In regard to Edom, Moab, and Ammon. Isaiah chapter 11 and verses 11 and 12. Let's read that. Isaiah 11 verses 11 and 12. Isaiah 11:11, it says, "And it shall come to pass in that day that the Lord shall set his hand again, the second time, to recover the remnant of his people, which shall be left from Assyria and from Egypt and from Pathros and from Cush and from Elam and from Shinar and from Hamath and from the islands of the sea." Verse 12, "And he shall set up an ensign for the nations and shall assemble the outcasts of Israel and gather together dispersed of Judah from the four corners of the earth." So we see that God's recovering his remnant people. This is prophetic. He's going to pull out those that are of his people from these different places. Then verse 14. But they shall fly upon the shoulders of the Philistines toward the west. They shall spoil them of the east together. They shall lay their hand upon Edom and Moab, and the children of Ammon shall obey them. What is this recovering of the remnant? What is it referring to? How they shall escape? They shall be recovered by God in this sense. Why? Because God's people are calling them out of Babylon. Come out of her, my people. The recovering of the remnant is done to a large degree by the call that is made in Revelation chapter 18. Come out of her, my people, and be not partakers of her plagues. Why? Because it says that Babylon is fallen, is fallen. There are going to be people that come out of Babylon at the last days. So from what I've looked at, to a great degree, it is the churches that are not chosen of God, but there are faithful people in there. Because you got to understand, when you look at Edom, Moab, and Ammon, where did Edom descend out from? Edom is the descendants of Esau. Although, who is the brother of Esau? Jacob, who was Israel, the chosen nation. Although God has a chosen people, he also has people in other places. Edom, or the descendants of Esau. And how about Moab and Ammon? Where did they come out from? They were the descendants of the daughters of Lot. Now, how did Lot's daughters get descendants? From Lot, the father. They committed fornication. And so when you look at the cry of the three angels' messages, and especially the second angel's message, where it says, Babylon is fallen, and has made all nations drink of the wine of the wrath of her fornication, you're seeing that also other churches are involved, but God has people in those churches. There's going to be recovering of the remnant, and it's not just the SDA church, but it's going to be also churches of other faiths. God has faithful people everywhere. That's why it says the four winds of heaven, four corners of the earth, they shall come out. And so, yes, God has a remnant church today, but he also has his people in other places. Now, we're going to stop right here for this class in this session. There's a few verses left to cover, but Daniel 11 and 12 are connected with one another. But you're beginning to see, now we're getting to the prophetic part of Daniel 11. Verses 40 onwards, much of it is unfulfilled prophecy. And much of it is going to be built on in also Revelation as well. So if you do not understand Revelation, it would be wise to go back or go forward and look at the book of Revelation as well. Because Daniel and Revelation, they're complementary books. But clearly, we're seeing now the papacy brought out. And there are many more verses that are spent describing this power than has the other verses. It spends about up to 15, 16 verses on the papacy. We'll finish off the rest of these verses in the next class. Let's kneel for a word of prayer. Let's pray. Father in heaven, we thank you for your word and how it is so exact in its fulfillment. But now, Lord, we are getting into the latter parts of Daniel 11, where we're seeing that prophecy is coming alive. Lord, we're living in a time when these verses are about to be fulfilled. I pray, O Lord, that you'd help us to diligently study these verses, that we may be ready, that we can discern the signs, and that we understand and help others to see that your word is true, that they may come out of Babylon. Help us, O Lord, to be faithful to thee and keep us in thy loving arms is our prayer in Jesus' name. Amen.